The Joe Rogan Experience.
Is option 4 the possibility that one day we could conceivably create some sort of an amazing simulation, but it hasn't been done yet? And this is why it's become this topic of conversation, is that there's some need for concern, because as you extrapolate technology and you think about where it's going now and where it's headed, there could conceivably be one day where this exists. Should we consider this and deal with it now?
Well, so I'd say that would be highly unlikely in that if the first two are wrong, right, then there are many more simulated ones than non-simulated ones will be over the course of all of history.
Over the course of all of history, but what if it hasn't yet happened?
But so then the question is, given that, that by the end of time there will have been, let's say, just a million simulations and one original history.
Sure.
And that all of these simulated people and the original history people all have subjectively indistinguishable experiences. You can't from the inside tell the difference.
Right.
Then what, given that assumption, would it be rational for you to believe? Should you think you're one of the exceptional ones? Or should you think you're one, amongst the larger set, the simulated ones?
Or should you think that it just has not happened yet?
But that would be equivalent to saying that you would be one of the non-simulated ones.
You're talking about in the universe.
But you could make it even just. You could look at the narrower case of just the Earth.
Let's just look in the narrow case of just the Earth.
Yeah.
In the narrow case of just the Earth, if the historical record is accurate, if it's not a simulation, then it seems very reasonable that we're just dealing with incremental increases in technology that's pretty stunning and pretty profound currently, but that we haven't experienced a simulation yet. Isn't that?
Well, that's how it looks, right?
Sure.
Yeah, but that's also how it would look if you were in a simulation.
Yes, but it's also how it would look if you're not in a simulation yet.
Right.
That's also a possibility too, no?
Right, yeah. But for most people for whom it looks like that, it would be the case that they would be simulated.
Why?
Well, by assumption, if there are all these simulations created.
Well, not yet.
Well, right,
but
you don't know what time. You don't know what time it is in external reality.
Right, but why would we assume something so unbelievably fantastic when just life itself is preposterous? Just life itself, just being a human being on a planet, this planet spinning 1,000 miles an hour, hurling through infinity, that in itself is fairly preposterous if it didn't exist. But it does exist. And we know that we're all agreeing upon a certain historical record. Right. We're agreeing upon Oppenheimer, the Manhattan Project, World War I, World War II. We're agreeing on Korea and Vietnam. We're agreeing on Reagan and Kennedy. We're agreeing on all these things historically. If we are all agreeing that there's a sort of historical process, and we are all agreeing, I remember when the first iPhone was invented. I remember when the first computer. I remember when this. I remember the internet. Why would we assume that there's a simulation? We could assume that there's a possibility of a simulation, but why would we assume the simulation hasn't occurred? Why wouldn't we assume the simulation hasn't occurred yet?
Right. I mean, so it is a possibility that we would be in the first time segment of all of these.
And wouldn't that be more likely if we
I'd say no. I mean, so it comes down then to this field, which is tricky and problematic, called anthropics. So this is about how to assign probabilities in situations where you have uncertainty about who you are, what time it is, where you are. So if you imagine, for example, all of these people who would exist in this scenario having to place bets on whether they're simulated or not. And you think about two possible different ways of reasoning about this. So one is you assume you're a randomly selected individual from all these individuals, and you bet accordingly.
Randomly selected individual.
Yeah, so then you would bet you're one of the simulated ones, because like a randomly selected ones, if most are simulated, most lottery tickets are...
But why are we assuming that most are simulated? This is where I'm getting confused.
Well, because if we'll have been simulated by the end of time.
Like, by the end of time.
This is like a timeless claim.
But why already, when it hasn't existed yet? Like, well, I'm like, let's say for the sake of argument, because I don't really have an opinion on this, pro or con. I'm open the air. But if I was going to argue about pragmatic reality,
Yeah.
the practicality of biological existence as a person that has a finite lifespan. You're born, you die, you're here right now, and we're a part of this just long line of humanity that's created all these incredible things, that's led up to civilization, that's led up to this moment right now where you and I are talking into these microphones, and it's being broadcast everywhere. Why isn't it likely that a simulation hasn't occurred yet? That we are in the process of innovating and one day could potentially experience a simulation, but why are you not factoring in the possibility or the probability that that hasn't taken place yet?
Yeah, I mean, so it's in there, but if you imagine that people follow this general principle of assuming that they would be the ones in the original history before the simulations had happened,
Right.
then almost all of them would turn out to be wrong, and they would lose their bet.
Once a simulation has actually...
Right. I mean, if you kind of integrate over,
Right.
The universe.
But there's no evidence that a simulation has taken place. But there is evidence that you're alive. You have a mother, you have a father.
Well, I mean,
you were
those
born.
things could be true in the simulation as well. I mean,
Could be, but
Yeah.
isn't that a pipe dream? We
well, it
don't
depends
know.
on what simulation, right? So, I mean, so a lot of simulations might run for a long time and have, etc.
Might.
Yeah.
But we know that if someone shoots you, you'll die. We know if you eat food, you get full. We know these things.
Mm-hmm.
These things could be objective facts. These could
Yeah.
be...
No, I think they are true. Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
right? Now, why would we assume? Why would a simulation be the most likely scenario when we've experienced, at least we believe we've experienced, all this innovation in our lifetime? We see it moving towards a certain direction. Why wouldn't we assume that that hasn't taken place yet?
Yeah, I think to try to argue for the premise that conditional on there being first an initial segment of non-simulated Joe Rogan experiences and then a lot of other segments of simulated ones,
Yes.
that conditional on that being the way the world in totality looks, you should think you're one of the simulated ones.
Why?
Well, to argue for that, I think then you need to roll in this piece of probability theory called anthropics, which I alluded to. And
Yes.
just to pull one little element out of there to kind of create some initial plausibility for this, if you think in terms of rational betting strategies for this population of Joe Rogan experiences, the ones that would lead to the overall maximal amount of winning would be if you all thought you're probably one of the simulated segments. If you had the general reasoning rule that in this kind of situation you should think that you're the initial segment of the non-simulated Rogan, then the great preponderance of these simulated experiences would lose their bets.
But there's no evidence of a simulation.
Well, I'd say that there is indirect evidence insofar as there is evidence against these two alternatives.
The two alternatives being that
They
people
doom,
intelligent
universal doom.
life goes extinct before they create any
Right.
sort of
Yeah.
simulation, or that they agree
Right.
to not
Yeah.
create a simulation. But what about if they're going to create a simulation? There has to be a time before the simulation is created. Why wouldn't you assume that that time is now currently happening when you've got a historical record of all the innovation that's leading up to today? If we understand...
Yeah, no, I mean, so I think the historical record would be there in the simulation, but there.
But why would it have to be there in a simulation and not be there in reality?
Well, I mean, it could be there in the simulation if it's a kind of simulation that
be there in
tracks the
reality.
original. Yeah. If it's a fantasy simulation, then maybe it wouldn't be there.
Right, but it could
But-
just be reality. It doesn't have to be a
Right.
simulation.
I mean, and in some sense, it would be both, right? I mean, there would be one Joe Rogan experience in the real original history, and then like maybe a million, let us say, in simulated realities later. But if you think about your actions that kind of can't distinguish between these different possible locations in space-time where you could be, most of the impact of your decisions will come from impacting all of these million Joe Rogan instances.
Yeah, but this
that
is
exist in the
once
simulation.
a simulation has been proven to exist, which it hasn't been. We have, at least in terms of what we all agree, we're proven to have biological lives. We breed, we sleep, we eat, we travel on planes. All these things
so
are
those
very
things are
tangible
true.
and
Yeah,
real.
I mean, I'd say those are are true, probably even if we're in a simulation.
But why would you assume we're in a simulation? This is where I'm stuck.
Yeah.
Because why wouldn't you assume that a simulation is one day possible? There's no proof or no evidence that makes any sense to me that there is currently any simulation.
Right. I mean, so it's a matter of and probabilities and numbers games, right?
Is it?
That's
what
I would
but this
assert,
current
yes.
reality.
Yeah.
But what would point to the possibility that it's more probable that we're in a simulation? This is what escapes me.
Okay, so I could mention some possibilities that would.
Okay.
So the most obvious, like imagine a big window pops up in front of you saying you're in a simulation. Click
Okay, that
here
would
for
be-
more
that would be
information. That would be
wonderful
pretty
information.
conclusive.
Right, yes.
Right. So short of that, you would have weaker probabilistic evidence insofar as you had evidence against the two alternatives. So, for example, if you got some evidence that suggested it was less likely that all civilizations at our stage go extinct before maturity. Let's say we get our act together, we eliminate nuclear weapons, we become prudent and we check all the asteroids, nothing is on collision course with Earth. That kind of tend to lower the probability of the first, right?
Okay.
So that would tend to shift probability over on the remaining alternatives. Let's suppose that we moved closer ourselves to becoming post-human. We develop more advanced computers and VR, and like we're getting close to this point ourselves, and we still remain really interested in running ancestor simulations. We think, this is what we really want to spend our resources on as soon as we can make it work. That would move probability over from the second alternative. Like it's less likely that there is this strong convergence among all post-human technologically mature civilizations if we ourselves are almost post-human and we still have this interest in creating ancestor simulations. So that would shove probability over to the remaining alternative. Take the extreme case of this. Like imagine if we, 1,000 years from now have built our own planetary-sized computer that can run these simulations, and we are just about to switch it on, and it will create a simulation of precisely people like ourselves. And as we move towards the big button to sort of initiate this, then the probability of the first two hypotheses basically goes to zero.
Right.
And then we would have to conclude with near certainty that we are ourselves in a simulation as we push this button to create 1 million simulations.
Once we achieve that state, but we have not achieved that state, why would we not assume that we are in the actual state that we currently experience?
Well, I
without a
suggest
simulation?
we shouldn't assume. We should assume that we are ignorant as to which of these different time slices we are, which of these different Joe Rogan experiences is the present one. We just can't tell from the inside which one it is.
Yeah, I'm still.
I mean, if you could see like some objective clock and say that, well, as yet the clock is so early that no simulations have happened, then obviously you could conclude that you're in the original history. But if we can't see that clock outside the window, if there is no window in the simulation to look out, then it would look the same. And then I'd say we have no way of telling which of these different instances we are.
And one of them might be that there is no simulation and that we're moving towards that simulation. That one day it could be technologically possible.
But one in a million.
Really? So one in a million is that life is what you experience right now. 1 in a million.
No. I mean, conditional on the other alternatives
but not even
being
conditioned
wrong.
on those other alternatives being wrong. Let's say that human beings haven't blown themselves up yet. Let's say that human beings haven't come up with there's no need to make the decision to not activate the simulation because the simulation hasn't been invented yet. Isn't that also a possibility? Isn't it also a possibility that the actual timeline of technological innovation that we all agree on is real and that we're experiencing this as real live human beings, not in a simulation, that one day the simulation could potentially take place but has not yet? Isn't that also a possibility?
Yeah, I mean, sure. It's just a question of how probable that is given the...
But why isn't it super probable? Because we're experiencing it.
Well, I mean, it would be a very unusual situation for somebody with your experiences to be in.
What about your experiences? Or
And
his
for my
experiences?
experiences, the same there, yeah. It would be extremely unusual.
But there's
usual.
7 billion unusual experiences
and
taking
those
place
would be,
simultaneously. Why would you assume
if there were, like, say, 1 million simulations,
right?
then, that would be a million times more.
But why would there be any
In this-
simulations? Why would there not just be 7 billion people experiencing life?
Right. Yeah. Then that would have to be something that prevents these simulations from being created.
This is where you lose me.
Yeah. So I think maybe the difference is I tend to think in terms of the world as a four-dimensional structure, with time being one dimension, right?
Okay.
And so you think in the totality of existence that will have happened by the end of time. You look at all the different experiences that match your current experience.
Okay.
Given these various assumptions, the vast majority of those would be simulated.
Why?
Well, the various assumptions being that option 1 and 2 are false, basically.
What about my option?
Yeah,
My
so
option
that
that
in
we're just
your
alive.
option, the vast majority of all these experiences that will ever have existed will also be simulated, if I understand your
No.
option
My
correctly.
option is that nothing's happened yet.
Yeah, but they will have been.
Maybe, but not
Well,
yet.
Right, but
So it's all
as I understand your
vaporware.
option is that if we look at the universe at the end of time and we look back, there will be a lot of simulated versions of you and then one original one.
But I'm
you
not even
think
considering
you
that.
might be the original one.
No, I'm not even considering that. What I'm saying is we may just be here. That there is no simulation. And
Right.
that maybe it will take place
Right, so-
someday,
so it-
but maybe it will not.
Right, but
So
you have to sort of pick which of those versions which of those scenarios you're considering.
that is the scenario I'm considering. The scenario I'm considering is we are just here. We are actually
but
alive.
what happens after? Like, so I want the scenario to say what's happened in the past, what happens now, and what will happen in the future.
Well, we don't
And then
know what's
conditional
going
on
to
that.
happen in the future.
Right, that's right. So we can consider both options, right?
Yes.
One option where there are no simulations created later,
Right.
then I would say that means one of the first two alternatives.
But another
the case.
option is there could be a
And that-
simulation created later, but it has not taken
Right,
place
and
yet.
that there will be simulations later.
That it's a possibility, but it
Right.
has not happened yet.
Right, but that there will be later. That's one
Yes.
possibility. And so then I say, if that's the world that we are looking at, then most experiences of your kind exist inside the simulation.
I still don't understand that. Why can it not have happened yet?
Well, it could. Depends on which of these experiences is your present moment in that scenario, right? So there's going to be a million of them plus an initial one. You can't tell from the
Someday
inside.
maybe there will be a million of them, but there's right now no evidence that there's going to be. No evidence that there is. No evidence that it's ever even going to be possible technologically. We think there could be, but it hasn't happened yet. So why would you assume that we are in a simulation currently when there's no evidence whatsoever that it's even possible to create a simulation?
Maybe there is some alternative way of trying to explain
I understand
how I'm thinking.
what
yeah,
you're
no, but
saying.
I'm thinking like suppose
I understand
take
you're
it-
saying that
well,
there's...
so-
I'm sorry to
well,
interrupt you.
sorry. No. I mean, I'm just thinking maybe we could think of some simpler thought experiment, which has nothing to do with simulations and stuff. But imagine if so I'm making this up as I go along. So we'll see if it actually works. But you are taken into a room, and then you're awake there for 1 hour, and then a coin is tossed, and if it lands heads, then the experiment ends and you exit the room and everything is normal again. But if it lands tails, then you're given an amnesia drug, and then you're woken up in the room again. You think you're there for the first time because you don't remember having been there before.
Right.
And then this is repeated 10 times. So we have a world where either there is one hour experience of you in the room, or else it's a world with 10 Joe Rogan experiences in the room with an episode of amnesia in between.
Right.
But when you're in the room now, you find yourself in this room, you're wondering, is this the first time I'm in this room? It could be. But it could also be that later on, and I was just given an amnesia drug.
Okay.
So the question now is, when you wake up in this room, you have to assign probabilities to these different places you could be in time. And maybe you have to bet or make some decision that depends on where you are. What I guess I could ask you, like, so if you wake up in this room, what do you think the probability should be that the coin that you're like at time one versus at some later time?
Well, what is the probability that I'm actually here versus what is the probability of this highly unlikely scenario that I keep getting drugged over and over again every hour?
Well, we assume that, like, you're certain that the setup is such that there was this mad scientist who had the means to do this and he was going to flip this coin.
Right.
So we're assuming that you're sure about that either way. The only thing you're unsure about is how the coin landed.
Okay, well, if that was a scenario where I knew that there was a possibility of a mad scientist and I could wake up over and over again, that seems like a recipe for insanity.
Well, it's a philosophical thought experiment.
It is a
so we
philosophical
can abstract away from
my
the
point
possibility
initially,
of it.
and I'll get back to it, is there's no evidence at all that we're in a simulation. So why wouldn't we assume that the most likely scenario is taking place, which is we are just existing, and life is as it seems, but strange.
So if you don't want to do this thought experiment, so
no,
then
I do want to do the thought
okay,
experiment, but it seems incredibly limited.
Right. Well, I'm trying to sort of distill the probability theory part from the wider simulation. But I guess I could also ask you, if we were to move closer to this point where we ourselves can create simulations, if we survive, we become a multiplanetary, we build planetary-sized computers. How would your probability in the simulation hypothesis change as we kind of develop along
Well, it
this?
would change based on the evidence of some profound technological innovation that actually would allow someone to create a simulation that's indistinguishable from reality.
Okay.
But I would rather assume that reality itself currently is just that, because it seems to be, isn't that Occam's razor? Isn't that the simplest answer? This is reality. This is wood. You are here. You actually are here. One day, there may be a simulation. It has not happened yet.
Yeah, I think it's not Occam's razor in that it would require you to postulate that you are this very unusual and special observer amongst all the observers that will exist.
But why is but everyone is unusual in their own way.
That's true, but
there's no clones. There's no one person that's a version that's living the same exact life in a million different scenarios.
But in this respect, if there are all these simulations, then most of these people are not special in this way. Most of them are simulated, and only a tiny minority.
If there's a simulation,
right? So many simulations.
Well, if there's no simulations,
well, then
you have 7
if there are
billion
no
unique
simulations
minds.
and there will never be any simulations, then
who's saying there never will be?
Well, so this since we don't know what time it is now in external reality,
right?
And we therefore can't tell from looking at our evidence where we are in a world where either there is just an original history and then it ends, or there is a world with an original history and then a lot of simulations. We need to think about how to assign probabilities given each of these two scenarios.
Right.
And so then we have a situation that is somewhat analogous to this one with the amnesia room, where you have kind of some number of episodes. And so the question is, in those types of situations, how do you allocate probability over the different hypotheses about how the world is structured? And this kind of betting argument is one type of argument that you can try to adduce to kind of get some grip on that. And another is by looking at various applications in cosmology and stuff, where you have multiverse theories, which say the universe is very big, maybe there are many other universes, maybe there are a lot of observers, maybe all possible observers exist out there in different configuration. How do you derive probabilistic predictions from that? Like, it seems like whatever you observe would be observed by somebody, so how could you test that kind of theory? And this same kind of anthropic reasoning that I want to use in the context of the simulation argument, also plays a role, I think, in deriving observational predictions from these kinds of cosmological theories, where you need to assume something like you're most likely a typical observer from amongst the observers that will ever have existed. Or so I would suggest. Now, I should admit as an asterisk that this field of anthropic reasoning is tricky and not fully settled yet. And there are things there that we don't yet fully understand. But still, the particular application of anthropic reasoning that is relevant for the simulation argument, I think, is one of the relatively less problematic ones. So that conditional on there being, by the end of time, a large number of simulated Joe Rogans and only one original one, I think, conditional on that hypothesis, it would seem that most of your probability should be on being one of the simulated ones. But I'm not sure I have any other ways of making it more
completely
vivid or
understand
plausible.
what you're saying. I completely understand what you're saying. But I don't know why you're not willing to take into account the possibility that it hasn't occurred yet.
Yeah, so I mean, the way I see it is that I have taken that into account, and
you
it
don't
receives
think
the
it's
same
likely?
probability that I'm that initial segment as I would give to any of the other Nick Bostrom segments that all have the same evidence.
See, that's where we differ, because I would give much more probability to the fact that we are existing right now in the current state as we experience it in real life, carbon life, no simulation, but that potentially one day there could be a simulation which leads us to look at the possibilities and look at the probabilities that it's already occurred.
All right, so what about this? Suppose it is the case that, all right, so what we think happened is there was a big bang, planets formed, and then some billions of years later we evolved, and here we are now, right?
Right.
Suppose some physicists told you that, well, the universe is very big, and early on in the universe, in very, very rare occasions, there was a big gas cloud. In an infinite universe, this will happen somewhere, right? Where just by chance, there was a kind of Joe Rogan-like brain coming together for a minute and then dissolved in the gas.
Right.
And yeah, if you have an infinite universe, it's got to happen somewhere. But there's got to be many, many fewer Joe Rogan brains in such situations than will exist later on planets, because evolution helps funnel probability into these kinds of organized structures, right? So if some physicist told you that, well, this is the structure of our part space-time, like there are like a few very, very rare spontaneously materialized brains from gas clouds early in the universe, and then there are the normal Rogans is much later. And there are, of course, many, many more normal ones. The normal ones happen in 1 out of every, 10 to the power 50 planets, whereas the weird ones happen in 1 out of 10 to the power of
Normal
100.
versus weird, how so? How are you defining?
Well, the normal ones are ones that have evolved on planets and had a mother and
different planets. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, different planets.
Okay, but we only have one planet, right?
Right,
that we're
but
aware
this
of that
again
has life.
is like a, well, I mean, actually, there are a lot of planets in the universe, and if
right,
it's
but
infinite,
one
there's
planet
got to be a lot
that
of copies
we're
of you,
aware
right?
that has life.
Right.
This is pure speculation, right?
Well, but this is a thought experiment, I mean,
Right.
which in fact actually probably is matches reality in this respect.
Most likely, there's some other planets out there. Well, the idea of,
I think the fact that it matches reality is, I think, irrelevant to the point I want to make.
Okay.
But so, if this turned out to be the way the world works, a few weird ones happening from gas clouds, and then the vast majority are just normal people living on a planet, would you similarly say, given that model, that you should think, oh, it might just as well be one of these gas cloud ones, because after all, the other ones might not have happened yet? Or have I lost you?
you lost me.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Anyway, I think that this would be a structurally similar situation where there would be a few exceptional early living versions that would be very small in numbers compared to the later ones. And if they allow themselves the same kind of reasoning where they would say, well, the other ones may or may not come to exist later on planets, I have no reason to believe I'm one of the planet-living ones, then it seems that in this model of the universe, you should think you're one of these early gas cloud ones. And as I said, I mean, this looks like it probably actually is the the world we're living in that it looks like it's infinitely big, and there would have been a few Joe Rogans spontaneously generated very early from random processes. They're going to be very few in numbers compared to ones that have, risen on planets. So that by taking the path you want to take with relation to the simulation argument, I wonder if you would not then be committed to thinking that you would be, like in effect, a Boltzmann brain in a gas cloud super early in the universe.
I still don't understand what you're saying. What I'm saying is that scientists agree. If you believe in science and if you believe in the discoveries that so far people have all currently agreed to, we've agreed that clouds are formed and that planets are created and that all the matter comes from inside of the explosions of a star and that it takes multiple times for this to coalesce before we can develop carbon-based life forms. All of that stuff science currently agrees on, right? And then we believe in single-celled organisms become multi-celled organisms through random mutation and natural selection. We get evolution, and then we agree that we have come to a point now where technology has hit this gigantic spike that you described earlier. So human beings have created all this new innovation. Why wouldn't we assume that all this is actually taking place right now with no simulation?
The simulation argument is the answer to that, but with the qualification that the simulation argument doesn't even purport to prove the simulation hypothesis, because there are these two alternatives. B, that even if the simulation hypothesis is true, in many versions of it, it would actually be the case that in the simulation, all of these things have taken place. And the simulation might go back a long time, and it might be a reality tracking simulation. Maybe these same things also happened before outside the simulation.
I understand that. Or all these things have actually happened, and there is no simulation yet.
Yeah.
That's possible, too. Doesn't that seem really probable?
Well, to me, it seems probable only if at least one of the other alternatives is true. Or, I admit that there is also this general possibility, which is always there, that I'm confused about some big thing, like maybe the simulation argument is wrong in some way. Like I'm just looking at the track record of science and philosophy we find we're sometimes wrong. So I attach some probability to that. But if we're working within the parameters of what currently seems to me to be the case, that we would be the first civilization in a universe where there will later be many, many simulations, seems unlikely for those exact reasons. And that if we are the first, it's probably because one of the alternatives is true.